Welcome to our Sustainable Kashi free permaculture class. Sustainable Kashi is proud to host these classes every week to help us all connect to our ecosystem and each other using permaculture as our foundation. We are located in Sebastian, Florida, on an 80-acre retreat center on the natural beauty of the Sebastian River. It's so truly beautiful here. It's really a oasis. We have 9 demonstration gardens, each with different growing styles. We kind of figure out what it takes to get each one working. So it's nice to get your hands on and really see what you can grow here in Florida. We also have an off-grid eco-village with regenerative systems that you can get your hands on and learn how they work. So we invite you all to plan a visit out here once we reopen, hopefully soon. So today we're talking about residential design, and it brings to mind the question of what is residential community? And of course, I think it's more than just a place that we sleep or a place that we eat or a place that we learn. It's kind of the combination of all these things and so much more. The more time we spend designing the systems to connect and integrate together, the more efficient and regenerative they become. So one of my inspirations in this is William McDonough, who wrote Cradle to Cradle. Excellent book if you get a chance to read it. And he has many great TED Talks and whole city designs that connect the energy and the food and social aspects of towns together. The waste from one system will feed another system and create abundance for the whole town. So residential design is a topic, and we're happy to introduce Greg today. Greg moved to Florida in 2015 to join the booming permaculture community out there, and to join the urban agriculture movement that's helped hundreds of homeowners in the Orlando area taking steps towards living resiliently and abundantly. I had the privilege to meet Greg a few years ago, and he's truly an innovator in urban agricultural movement. So now he's the founder and owner of Connected Landscapes, which is a permaculture-inspired landscaping design company in Orlando. So Greg, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us.
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me. That was my intro. So yeah, I also just wanted to say thank you for your tutelage. And a lot of what I'm going to talk today may sound quite familiar because a lot of it either came directly from you or was inspired heavily by the PDC that we did. That's been last year already, hasn't it? So cool. So I'm going to figure out if I can share my screen. So yeah, so we're going to talk about designing residential abundance. Like Terry said, I am a permaculture inspired landscape designer. I have installed a lot of gardens here in Orlando. And what I kind of want to structure the talk around today is sort of my design philosophy and then the things that I get asked about a lot. This is probably going to go deep, maybe deeper than you were expecting. But I promise that if you'll let me go as deep as I'm going to try to go today, that at the end of the talk, you can ask me whatever you want about anything, no matter how it's small and slow or otherwise. So the first thing I want to talk about is the holy trinity of value. And this is, in terms of my kind of business philosophy, this is a hugely important concept. So if you're not familiar with this, you'll see it like hanging up in like mechanic shops or like, like mom and pop restaurants, almost always by the cash register. And it's some version of this, this meme that just says like, so good, fast, and cheap, you can only pick 2. And I found this to be overwhelmingly true, particularly in the context of running a business. And so for this exercise, we define cheap specifically as like the resources required to do something, not necessarily money. This is really interesting. So you have something that's good and fast, it's not going to be cheap. You have something that's good and cheap, it's not going to be fast. You have something that's fast and cheap, it's not going to be good. And I want you to look at this image and tell me what you think. And this is a real question. You actually have to type it into chat. What you think, which of those 2 our society is based around, based on these images. And I can't see, can I see the chat at the same time? Yeah, okay, good. So that looks pretty unanimous. Yes, fast and cheap. So our entire civilization is built around fast and cheap. And I want to be really clear too that like I'm not, there's going to be a lot of points in this where it's going to seem very accusatory or sort of self-righteous. And I want to be very, very clear that I adore pizza. I had literally pizza last night. I adore French fries. I wear clothes that were produced in abysmal conditions. I drive an ancient car that uses fossil fuels. I have a cell phone. I don't want these kinds of conversations really quickly descend into kind of this really moral place where it's like, well, why are we? That's not the point, right? We just want to look at what is, like, what are the actual conditions of the systems that we're designing? And I think that when we're talking about designing residential abundance in the United States particularly, it's really important to think about the broader cultural context in which we're designing for, right? So like on some level, when we're talking about residential design, like in terms of the horticulture, in terms of the actual food, in terms of the homesteading techniques, there is a wealth of information available, right? Like there's people in this chat currently that I promise know more about me or know more than me about how to grow sweet potatoes, how to grow different varieties of cassava, what mangoes work best. I don't think, at least when clients come to me, I don't think that's what they're really looking for. Because almost invariably, my clients already have kind of a hort background. They almost always have some fruit trees. They almost always have some sweet potatoes. They almost always have something growing already. They're taking steps, they're composting. When they bring me in, what they're almost always looking for is a plan. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about that planning in a second. In terms of the actual horticulture, it's really easy. Like, I mean, you grow perennial foods, and then if you're south of Lake Apopka, you can grow fruit trees that need less than 100 chill hours. Like it's really like, I would just start experimenting in terms of what foods you can plant, because it's really easy to get into the weeds there. What I want to talk about today is a plan, not plants, right? And that may be disappointing for some of you, and I really apologize again. If you'll let me go deep, I promise if any of you have any questions about actual gardening, I have installed over 500 gardens. I'm a 4th generation farmer. Like, I will happily answer your horticulture questions at the end of this if you still have them. But planning is super, 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 super important. And again, like I said, I think this is the real service that I'm being hired for. And what I often find is that, so when I get brought into a system, when I get brought into somebody's backyard, I almost exclusively design somewhere around 1/4 acre lots. It's pretty standard lot size here in Orlando. It's almost always, you know, like a youngish couple. They maybe have a couple of kids. Fairly standard demographic kind of range for what I'm working with usually. And the first thing I say is, why am I here? So I'll have them walk around the yard, and we'll kind of talk about plants and this and that. I have a drainage problem over here, and I've got this fruit tree that doesn't produce fruit or whatever. You know, it's really hot over here. We want shade. And then I'll go, okay, so you've just walked me through all of the issues that you've identified and kind of what's working and what's not. But why am I here? Why are you interested in permaculture specifically? And the quality of that answer is really, really important for coming up with a plan that over time is going to work. And it's a really hard question if you're not used to setting intentions, if you're not used to really listening to yourself and kind of getting in touch with your own ideas. That could be a really daunting question, like, what am I doing? It's a really scary question in a lot of cases. But it is the thing that kind of precipitates everything else. Once you have the big idea, once you have the concept that you're trying to achieve, everything else kind of falls into place. So that's almost always what I'm trying to get. And what will sometimes, like an example of an answer that I'll get is, well, I want to live more sustainably. And I want to live more sustainably is a good thing, but in terms of an actionable goal, it's really hard. Like, if you want to live more sustainably, there's a lot of things you could do. You could ride a bike. You could go full Rob Greenfield. You could, you could just give up airline travel. You could just go vegan. Like, living sustainably is pretty broad and nebulous. And there's not necessarily a moment at which you're going to say, oh, now I am officially living more sustainably. I think it's actually, that kind of thinking has a tendency to breed a lot of anxiety. I know it does in me, where it's like, am I doing enough? Am I stopping the climate crisis on my own? The reality is that that's not what's being asked of you. So like another example of an answer to that question, I think maybe hits the brief a little better is, okay, so I'll say, why am I here? And then if this is the answer I get, I know we're on the right track. It's like, well, my grandfather had a garden. When I was a little girl, you know, we'd go and in the summer, we'd help my grandfather with the garden. And I remember like seeing all of the food that him and my grandmother had like in jars up on the shelves. And I remember just how happy it made us as a family and thinking, you know, like this is a great way to live. And I want my kids to have that. Perfect. That's a perfect goal because it's not only connected to who you are as a person, it's also actionable. You'll know the moment that that's happening. I might not, but you'll know the moment that you get that same feeling of like, oh man, this is just like it felt helping my grandfather. Like we have a bunch of cans of food set up for the winter. You know, we had, or the summer, I guess, in the case of Florida, you know, the kids are learning, the kids are eating vegetables that they didn't used to eat because they grew them themselves. That's an actionable goal. And it's one that's connected to like a really deep personal place. So you set that intention. And then you start to work from that. And then what I typically will do when I'm designing for someone is I'll look at the system and go, okay, given that big idea and given the conditions on the site that we identified, what is the thing that we can do that's going to really start that ball rolling towards abundance the most meaningfully? And there's a tendency here for this to get really out in the weeds and really pretty wild. And we have to remember that one of the permaculture principles is slow and small solutions. So you don't have to feel like you like the thing that makes the biggest impact doesn't have to be a nuclear fission reactor that is powered by like, you know, kohlrabi or whatever. It can be as simple as, well, you know, we've got this room that gets a ton of sun. We're going to plant a mulberry in front of it to get dappled shade in the summer. And, you know, the leaves will die back in the winter. So we'll still get the sun when it's a little bit colder outside. It'd be very simple. And once you have that idea, and once you're in this mindset of like, this is the goal I'm trying to accomplish, what's going to make the biggest impact starts to make a lot of sense. If I'm working on a design and it's not clicking, I almost always know it's because I haven't figured it out yet. And that's what my ever-patient fiance will listen to me kind of grumbling at our kitchen table as I'm furiously scrawling like a madman on all these different papers. And like, I can't figure it out. I don't know what this one is. And almost invariably, it'll kind of hit me that there was something that person said, and this is what we're really talking about. And once that happens, it starts to flow. And so you find those things that are going to start that ball rolling in the most meaningful way. And we go patterns to details. And this is something that Terry talked a lot about in our PDC. And it's really, really been one of the most transformative ideas in my own kind of permaculture practice and just in my life in general. He talked about this thing called the scale of permanence. And I don't know if you made that up or not. I've never been able to find really anybody else talking about it, but whoever came up with it, it's brilliant. So when you're in a system, you have to look at the things that you can change versus the things that you can't, right? So if we're designing a garden in Florida, we can't change that we're in Florida. That would be really silly, right? Like that's just absurd. We can't change our geographical location. We probably can't really change the political structures, right? Like if it were illegal to grow tomatoes in Florida, it'd be really hard to change that in a lot of cases. And then we can, and you know, like the way that water moves through a property, that takes you can change it, but it takes a lot of work. Then we get kind of all the way down to plants. Plants are really easy to change. I mean, it's work again, but you can rip out sod and you can put in trees and you can chop down trees and you can compost things. It's pretty easy to change plants. So when you're designing from patterns to details, you're looking at that big idea. You're looking at what the overall conditions are of your site. And then you're saying, okay, what do I have the power to change that's going to create the most meaningful change? And if you start designing this way, it's going to be really, really powerful. What I would encourage you to do, insofar as it's possible, is to not really get anxious about the particular varieties of things. Like there's people in the state that have, like there's Andy Firk, there's Josh Jameson, there's Terry, there's Pete Canaris, there's all these guys that have a wealth of horticultural knowledge. And like insofar as like mango cultivation is a cool hobby, like absolutely do it. Absolutely nerd out about varieties of plants. But if what you're finding is that it's really making you anxious, feeling like you're not growing the right varieties, you're not finding the right solutions, things aren't working the way that you thought that they were going to, don't look at that as a failure or as a problem. It's just experimentation. It's a practice. I talk a lot about how gardening is meditation. And in the same way that like invariably meditation becomes about realizing how bad you are at paying attention, uh, gardening almost always becomes a process of learning how little you actually understand anything that's going on the planet. And once you kind of release yourself from that anxiety of being like, oh my God, did I get the right diascoria, a lot of yams, or are these the, release yourself from that anxiety and just be like, okay, am I growing yams? Yes. Do we have food in the kitchen? Then we're good, right? So make that big idea, work from what's going to be the most impactful, and then patterns to details, right? You start hitting those three things, you're going to start seeing that the systems you're designing start to make a lot more sense. One of the other things that we talk about a lot is mulch. So I'll go to a person's house, and everybody knows in permaculture that you mulch, right? What I almost always end up talking about with my clients is why. Why do we mulch? I'll ask them a lot. I go, do you know why we sheet mulch? And I go, well, because we need to build soil. Well, that's true. That is why we need to sheet mulch. But do you really understand why? Like, why do we need to build soil with mulch in Florida? And we can get really into the weeds on soil science right now. And I don't necessarily want to go that far. But I think this is a good kind of window into a broader discussion about the techniques that we're using. So it's really easy to kind of troll some permaculture forums or like read a couple of books and be like, okay, so what I'm going to do is sheet mulch, I'm going to plant cassava and plant sweet potatoes, and then I'll be doing the permaculture. And what I would invite you to do is maybe take a step back and look at some of the reasons why those techniques are being used. When Bill Mollison started kind of developing permaculture and finding these indigenous farming techniques and figuring out how to do all this stuff, what he was really doing was the first permaculture principle. He was observing and he was interacting and he was figuring out what really truly worked and what really truly didn't work. And mulching with wood chips in Florida works great over time. But if you talk to like even an IFAS extension, they'll tell you not to do it a lot of times. And the reason is because if you dump a whole bunch of wood chips on top of cardboard onto sand, you need to understand the relationship between those wood chips and that sand. So sand is inert, right? There are hydroponic farms that actually use sand as a growing media because it has no real pH. It doesn't really hold water. It doesn't really hold anything. It's basically to kind of hyperbolize what's happening. If you think about those like aquarium glass beads, imagine trying to grow a plant and nothing but those aquarium glass beads. It obviously won't work because there's no biology in the soil. There's no nutrients. There's no nothing. And this is because of a property called cation exchange, which I would encourage you to Google and learn more about because it's endlessly fascinating. But basically, sand doesn't have any chemistry. So to make sand have chemistry, we have to start to change the chemistry of the soil particles. And the easiest and cheapest way to do that in Florida is to put a whole bunch of organic material on top of the sand. And then what will happen is you have all of these things that come and they kind of nibble on it. They're going to digest it. And then all of that energy that's stored in that plant material is going to dissolve and it's going to end up in the sand. And the sand's not really changing. You're really just kind of adding things to it. But what will become possible is that water will be able to be stored. Bacteria will have places to live. Mycorrhizae fungi will have things to kind of cling onto and interact with. And you'll be creating a much more robust ecosystem, right? So we use mulch because it's free, not because it's perfect. But what I often will see too is that people will do this mulching, people will put down a foot of cardboard and mulch or whatever, or 6 inches of cardboard and mulch. And they'll plant all their cool fruit trees, all of our fun psidiums and sugar apples and all this cool stuff. And assuming that you're mulching correctly, where you're leaving like a space around the root of the tree and everything, that's neither here nor there. Nothing happens. The system kind of stalls out. Or maybe you start to have some fungal issues, or maybe you start to have nutrient issues like deficiencies and stuff. And so we know that sand doesn't work. And we know that mulch improves the sand. So we have those issues and we go, okay, well, more mulch must be the answer. And what will happen is if you add even more mulch onto sand that doesn't have very much biology, is that the nitrogen that's being released by all of these different processes is going to get bound up into the carbon, which is mostly what you're adding to the soil when you're adding wood chips. And this is a great thing to do over time. But if we go back to nature, we think about forests again, right? If we think about wild spaces, I have never been to a forest that was an actual wilderness preserve where the floor of the forest was covered in mulch. And the reason is because it's not necessary, right? So it's important not to let this stuff kind of overtake you, but it is important to understand why you're doing what you're doing, right? There's adding organic material to soil, and then there's adding so much that you've bound up nutrients, right? And when we're talking about soil too, you have to understand what it is that you need. So if you're growing herbaceous plants, they want a more bacterial soil. If you're growing woody stemmed plants like trees, they want a more fungal soil. So what a lot of people will do is they'll go to Monterey mushroom, they'll get a whole bunch of mushroom compost, they'll dump it on the ground, and they'll just indiscriminately plant in it. And Monterey mushroom compost has been treated to grow mushrooms, so it's super productive. But after a while, what you'll find is that almost always are going to start to have nutrient imbalances. You might start to have some pest imbalances, right? Some organisms that are showing up that are doing things that you don't necessarily want. And the reason is because that's going to promote an incredibly fungal soil. And it also has like way more nitric salts than could ever possibly be bioavailable to a plant. So now you've created an imbalance. If you're, and I've used Monterey mushroom compost, like far be it from me to denigrate Monterey mushroom compost, but it is important to understand the context in which it needs to be used. And again, if we're going back to what's our plan, what's the most meaningful action we can take right now, and what's that scale of permanence, what's that pattern to details, these things start to kind of take care of themselves. You'll understand what's happening. And here's just also just a random castaway thought that I wrote down. Drive through a neighborhood and look at all of the bazillions of bags of leaf litter and branches and all kinds of stuff that people are literally throwing away. What if we started to kind of normalize sharing some of that stuff? Like in the spring here, when the oak trees all shed their winter leaves and put on their spring foliage, right? Everybody in all of Orlando is throwing away bags and bags and bags and bags and bags of oak leaf litter, which once it's been properly composted is like one of the best composts there is. I thought, what an opportunity. What if we started to make these decisions as a community to use these sources of abundance instead of having to wait on chip drop to drop 25,000 cubic yards of wood chips in the middle of your street and make all your neighbors angry. Like your neighbors are probably already producing enough fertility for you to use a little bit of it, and it's going to go a really long way. And so when we're talking too about interactions in their system, right? This is, I'm pretty sure, I see this sign online all the time. I'm almost positive it's at Green Isle Gardens, which is a nursery over kind of in Groveland. It's in my opinion, one of the best native nurseries in the state. And it's very true. If something's not eating your plants, then your garden's not part of the ecosystem. One of the things that I see, I'm a member of like a truly unfathomable number of Facebook groups that talk about plants and horticulture and vegetable gardening and permaculture. And all of the time, I see somebody saying, I have, X pathogen. I have X plant or aphid or whatever, right? What am I supposed to do? And there are basically two schools of thought. One school of thought is that you should, with all fire and fury, just bring down the might of modern science onto that pest and eradicate it out of existence. And mind you, I'm not necessarily talking about the kind of classic toxic chemicals, right? Like I'm not necessarily even talking about things like glyphosate. I'm not talking about things that are like synthetic pest controls. People will go, we'll just spray it with neem. Well, neem's a broad spectrum insecticide. It doesn't discriminate. I mean, it doesn't necessarily kill things, but it's going to fundamentally change the balance of biology in your garden in a major, major, major way, right? And so another thing that I'll see, and you've got the picture of our friends, the ladybird beetles here, is people say, well, order ladybirds online and then release them into your garden. And this is one of those things, again, where we have to remember the just first permaculture principles, right? Like patterns to details and observe and interact. If you have a pest problem and you don't have anything preditizing those insects, that's odd. Because ladybirds are exclusively a predatory insect. So if you have a bunch of aphids and you don't have ladybugs, it's a little unusual because that's what ladybugs eat. So it's strange that you wouldn't already have them. So if you're gonna order them, you gotta ask yourself, okay, well, I'm gonna order these, why weren't they here already? And what I'll tell you to do, just as an exercise, and some of you that are like really, really great master gardeners are going to freak out at this, and that's fine. It's just an exercise. You don't actually have to do this in real life, although it is fun to do this. Imagine for a second that your garden, your intention in gardening has literally nothing to do with you getting anything out of it. You're never going to harvest a single tomato. You're never going to get any food out of it ever once. The entire purpose of the garden, whatever your land is, like the reason that you're interacting with that is just to create a space for other things to live. Try to grow aphids. Try to get as many aphids as you possibly can eating your greens and see what happens. If you're scared of snakes, try to bring in snakes. See what happens. And what will happen invariably is that when we're talking about a residential neighborhood, we're talking about a deeply disturbed ecosystem. So if you start actively trying to just support biology, just rote biology, not even anything, you're not selecting for anything. You just want as many organisms as possible to come to your backyard. Watch how quickly that system will balance itself. If you try to grow aphids, watch how quickly things will show up to eat those aphids. And next year, I cannot imagine that you will have a problem with them because you'll have the biology in place already. When we treat those imbalances as isolated incidences, we create more imbalances. If we let that stuff work itself out on its own, it's scary, it sucks, especially when all your plants get eaten and you don't get a harvest. But over time, you're fine. If you haven't read One Straw Revolution by, and I know I'm gonna butcher this name, Masanobu Fukuoka, there's a really amazing passage really early in that book. So you don't even have to finish it if you don't want to, just read this part, where he talks about having like this devastating plague of some kind of insect. I can't remember what it was, like a mite or a grasshoppers or something. And his whole thing was like, well, I'm just not gonna do anything. And he didn't do anything. And his rice was getting devastated. And he goes out one morning and the dew has just fallen and the entire field is completely silver. And he thought he was like dreaming or hallucinating or something. And he realized that the entire field was covered in spiders, and that the spiders were eating all of those insects. And that year he had one of the best yields he's ever had after those spiders ate all those insects. And then going forward, he didn't have to do anything to treat those pests because there was a biology. And you see that there's a picture of two wolves down there. So Yellowstone, a little while ago, I think it's maybe 20, 30 years ago, somebody might know a little better. They realized that there were some imbalances in Yellowstone National Park. And this is probably the biggest natural preserve that exists. Certainly one of the biggest ones that exists in the United States, but it's possible that it's one of the biggest ones, period, that's actively being kind of managed, which is sort of paradoxical, I know, but we're going to talk about that. So they said, well, we don't have any wolves. Historically, there should be wolves here. And we have this explosion of elk. So they released 14 wolves. And what pretty quickly happened is that these wolves started to control this elk population. And they obviously ate some of the elk calves, but they also shifted the population to other feeding grounds. And willow trees started to regrow. When the willow trees started to regrow, beavers started to come into these little tributary streams that they hadn't been in for years and started to build dams. When the beavers built dams, they created floodplains. And the floodplains created but brought in frogs and turtles and fish, and then that brought in raptors and on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Now, some of you may already, and I can't see it to the chat again, but some of you may be going, that's not true, that's not true, they already debunked that. It's heavily debated the degree to which the wolves actually impacted the biology in Yellowstone, at least exclusively. What we do know is that we as humans saw a system that was lacking a deficiency, or that had an imbalance, and that was an imbalance of predation. We reintroduced those predators, and no matter what you attribute it to, that system is now balanced. And what I would point out is that even if it wasn't the wolves, I guarantee whatever has precipitated that change, if you don't want to attribute it to the wolves, is because they started thinking, what would happen if we were not the major ingredient in this system? What would happen if we reintroduced ecology? It is a powerful, powerful thing. So again, that mental exercise, what would happen if you gardened not for your own sake, but just for the sake of the ecology in your garden? I think you would find pretty quickly that it is impossible for nature to produce less than abundance. It's very easy for a human system to do that. So the other thing that I see missing from a lot of systems that I'm involved in when I come to a place, very frequently, like one of the first questions I'll get is maintenance. How am I going to take care of this? What if I grow too much food? And sort of on the other hand, a lot of what people are interested in is self-sufficiency. We talk about self-sufficiency a lot. Like American culture is very interested in this idea of like the rugged individual, like the Daniel Boone. But what I've found is that self-sufficiency is best achieved with a bunch of other people, right? So humans are social, just as a species. And if I grew up in a religious context, and I know that thinking of humanity as a species can be kind of a touchy subject for some people. But in this context, you can think of humans as the creation of God. You can think of humans as an accident created by mathematics. Just think of humans as an organism. We are incredibly social. We're probably the most social thing that exists. I mean, and if you want to prove that to yourself, go to the forest right now alone and don't take anything with you that you didn't make yourself. And I'm sure that you've already thought, boy, that's going to be tough, right? If you want to see this in practice, you can watch Into the Wild and see how well that goes for that young guy. Not terribly well. We are very social. We don't really want to be isolated. This coronavirus thing has really kind of illuminated, I think, that for a lot of people, that when we're cut off from our communities, it's unpleasant. It feels bad. And we're literally helpless. We need help from other people. And we've weirdly demonized this idea that other people asking for help is bad. We want to live in tribes. So there's some scientific study that's been done. I haven't checked in on this in a while. This may have changed a little bit, but they were basically looking at primate skulls way back in the day, and were kind of identifying the size of the tribe of the group of chimps based on the size of the skull. And as a joke, somebody put a human skull into the experiment, and they looked at the skull and they went, okay, well, that chimp, it's a big skull, but that would want, something like 100 and 150 to 100 to 150 people in its, or other members in its group. And then somebody was like, well, that's a human. And I went, holy smokes. So they started looking at that. If you really think about it, there's probably about 100 to 150 people at any given time that are like really, really important to you. Obviously there are different levels of compassion. There's different levels of empathy. We can think globally. I'm not saying that outside of that 150, you wish harm on people. But we do want to be in groups. We want to be in tribes. It's like one of the most natural impulses that you have is to find your tribe. We see that's like the hashtag squad goals, right? Like we want to find groups of people with kind of like-minded ideas and hang out with them. And that structure is unbelievably powerful, right? Like, so one of my favorite Bible stories is the Tower of Babel, which is a story in which all of humanity gets together and starts building this tower, and God is like, holy woods, this can't happen. I mean, like they're going to usurp me, God, if they keep working together. Regardless of what you feel about that kind of spiritually or morally, I think the lesson there is clear, is that that book is communicating that humans united together are tremendously powerful, whether they're using it for good or for bad. When we talk about these protests that have been going on, right? Regardless of what politically you think about this protest, you cannot deny that in as little as a week of these neighborhoods coming together, they got what they wanted. They were very quickly getting results, right? And again, it doesn't matter what you feel politically about whether that was good or bad. The point is, people got together and people got what they wanted really, really quickly. This almost always happens. One of the most important books that I ever read is a book called The Life and Death of Great American Cities by a woman named Jane Jacobs. She was really interested in the way that we design cities. And she kind of looked at these huge, huge, huge cities like Chicago, Manhattan, Paris, Barcelona. And if you look at Paris or Manhattan, that's probably the only two that I have any immediate familiarity with, you'll find that they kind of have these smaller subsection neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods are really, really, really important. Like, no one necessarily identifies with like the city of New York as much as they identify with like their part of Brooklyn, because you have the boroughs, but then you even have smaller neighborhoods. The same thing in Paris. There's like the place where there's the market streets, there's like the art district. Those neighborhoods have their own individual identity. And when we start to work at that level, it starts to get pretty crazy. My computer is about to die, so I have to take 1 second and grab my charger. Actually, it looks like, okay, hold on.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating for this brief intermission of Greg's presentation. I really appreciate the fact that we have chargers and that we can charge our computers in this high technological time. Thank you, Greg, for charging your computer.
Yes, sorry about that, everybody. I thought for sure I would get through on a full charge. Anyway, so yeah, so we have these cities that work as neighborhoods. These neighborhoods are tremendously powerful, right? Where is the rest of my notes? There they are. So when I'm working with a client, right, almost invariably, the biggest budget item that we are going to look at is how we're going to actually get the work done. Almost always. It's almost always the biggest budget item. Because when we're talking about sheet mulching, again, when we're talking about planting dozens, if not, several dozens of trees, dozens of herbaceous plants, tearing out sod, doing all this stuff, that takes a ton of work, right? So you need help. This is a picture of my good friend James, who also was in the PDC with me. And this is a raised bed. This is a picture of us building a raised bed for Live Like Alley, which was the nonprofit that Rob Greenfield worked with. And this is the guy that we were building it for. And he just kind of came home from work and just jumped out and started helping us. And James and I think at this point had maybe built like 2 or 3 of these raised beds, like just 4x8 standard raised beds. And I think it was taking us maybe all told, like, I don't know, 2 hours, 3 hours to get it built. We built this one in like 45 minutes just by adding one other guy, because humans are a force multiplier, right? And so not only was it cool that he was involved in constructing his own garden, it literally got done faster, right? This is a tremendously important idea, is that the people that are around you are probably the biggest untapped potential that you have. So when we're talking about making a plan and finding the thing that's the most impactful, I would almost guarantee that the thing that is the most impactful is not adding another fruit tree. It's not finding a different variety of yam. It's not sheet mulching. It's like if your yard is currently grass and Asian ornamental plants, I would almost promise you that just introducing yourself to your neighbors is a more impactful thing to do than anything that you could do that's a homesteading kind of like hard skill thing. Again, not at all undermining those hard skills, but in terms of power, I have never witnessed anything that was more transformative than people working together. That is invariably the thing that makes the biggest difference for the good or for the positive, right? So I don't remember why I wrote ignoring a problem isn't a solution. I do think that's true, but I can't remember what it has to do with this. But what if you applied that biology mindset shift, right? So the thing where we're talking about what if your garden was for other organisms? What if you applied that to your interactions with other people, right? What if your entire goal was to never get anything back yourself, to just give to other people? Now, and that gets into an area, I want to be sensitive to this too, where a lot of people struggle with that, right? Like having this kind of feeling like they need to be available for other people, like to the point that it becomes destructive. I'm not talking about an imbalance. And again, we're not even talking about really practically doing this. Just think about that logically. What would happen if anytime somebody interacted with you, your whole goal was to give something to them? I struggle with this immensely. One of the things I constantly think about myself is I need to be more selfless in my actions. But what I'll tell you is that when I have been able to do that, when I have been able to meet people and try to give something of myself instead of worrying about what I'm going to get from them, pretty quickly, I have more help and more resources and more friends and more just abundance than I could ever possibly use. It starts to actually get stressful how much help you get just by trying to help other people. It's incredible. Whether you wanted to ascribe it to just sort of like raw mathematics or God or whatever, right? There's something about the world in which we live where if you start to act generously, resources will come to you. Like you will become an enzyme of just catalytic change. And I think that works regardless of what your intentions are. Just if you're trying to help other people, you're going to quickly find that you have more opportunities than you can possibly manage. One of the things that I see a lot, especially these days on Facebook, is this idea of like agri-hoods. Like there's a meme that keeps going around that's like, I don't remember exactly. It's like this city in Sweden decided to grow food on its lawns instead of, or grow food instead of lawns. And it's like a paradise. And almost always those memes are captioned with, why aren't we doing this in America? Well, we're not doing it in America because we're not doing it. There was no special thing that had to happen for those people to decide to grow food. We don't need to build multi-million-dollar developments where all the houses are like made out of hay bales and then there's solar panels on top of them. And we don't need to do that to start to take advantage of the resources that we've already accumulated. Like all of my clients live in the suburbs, almost all of them. So they're surrounded by hundreds of people in houses that are built out of concrete, almost universally on land that used to be agricultural land. So that's land that's been cleared, it's been managed to some degree, and there are structures there that are relatively stable. I think if what we're looking at that and saying is we have to tear all that down and rebuild, that is not really very catch and store energy mindset, I wouldn't say, which is another permaculture principle, right? We're trying to take advantage of the resources that we already have and maximize the value of it. Every neighborhood in the country is an agrihood, right? If you plant sweet potatoes in your front yard, in your neighborhood, and your neighbor plants cassava, and the person 2 doors down plants 2 avocado trees, and then the person across the street has chickens, that's an agrihood, right? It might not have a fancy sign, it might not be on the news, but that's an agrihood, right? So we don't have to have big, complicated solutions, right? Simple, small solutions. It really is that simple. If you meet your neighbors, you have a plan, you're trying to do the thing that's the most impactful, you're solving these problems as you come to them, and you're designing from patterns to details, I'm pretty sure you'll find unbelievably quickly that you have completely transformed the neighborhood that you live in. So another thing that I get the complaint about a lot is, well, I hate my HOA. I always go, well, do you go to the meetings? No. Well, of course you'd hate it then. You're not a part of it, right? And so, I mean, some HOAs obviously are nightmarish, but in a lot of cases, when I've presented at HOAs, when I've gone to community associations, there's like 4 people in a room that could seat 200 people. They're all 300 years old. And they're like, yeah, of course those people aren't like trying to turn their neighborhood into like a progressive bastion utopia neighborhood. Like they're just clinging to life. I would suggest that there's almost no American institution more perfectly suited to take advantage of permaculture principles than an HOA. It's a decentralized, democratic, non-governmental institution that can create rules about land management with basically no government oversight, right? It's pretty insane. What else do we have that unites that many people just by default? And what I would suggest is, again, if you're having problems with your HOA, getting involved is almost certainly going to start to move the needle. Because it like when people say, I hate my HOA, I always go, well, how do you feel about the neighborhood? And they always go, well, we love the neighborhood. I go, well, what's weird that the neighborhood doesn't include the people that live in it. Like, that's a strange belief system. And again, I'm not trying to be condescending. It's one of those things that it's really easy to fall into that mental pattern of this is my house, I am alone here, and the people around me are not even people, they're not anything, right? Like, this is my my quarter acre, and the people on the other side of the fence are relevant. I said earlier, people go, well, what if I have more food than I can handle? And I always just point to all them. I go, okay, well, I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I count 6 houses that I can see from this yard. You think you can grow more food on this quarter acre than all 6 of those houses need? Because if you do that, that's going to be awesome. And I'm going to put it all over my website. And that is not going to be a problem at all, because that would be a miracle of agriculture. Share, meet your neighbors. And think about how we can use those problems as solutions, right? Like, again, if you have a problem with an organization that is inherently democratic, that is inherently in the business of managing land, and you're a permaculturalist, see if you can't move that needle a little bit and approach that from a perspective not of being combative, but go to these people. What is an HOA trying to do, right? They're working with a landscape firm, like a huge company like Brightscape or Brightview Landscaping or something like that. Who's working with a management company, and that giant landscaping company wants to get the biggest commission it can get, right? That's what it's trying to do. The management company is going to get a kickback off of that commission, probably. So if your HOA is working with 2 organizations that are both trying to sell you a landscaping plan, it's no surprise that that's going to be a big, expensive landscaping plan. If you go to your HOA and say, hey, can we maybe like look at alternatives? And you're working with professionals that are good. There's a ton of people who are amazing native landscaping designers. Just planting trees would eliminate mowing. There's a lot of ways that you can start to change the way that your neighborhood works without anybody getting bent out of shape, without anybody getting riled up about it. And that's sort of what we do. I mean, that's the core of democracy, is that everyday interaction that you have with people to try to come up with better solutions to affect the way that you live. And so if you start to have gardens and you start to meet your neighbors, pretty quickly, if a bunch of you and your neighbors are talking, that is going to be community, right? You're starting to build culture. And this has been a big discussion lately on a ton of those Facebook groups. I've seen articles written about it. It's just a big discussion. Things are very polarized right now. We're kind of trying to find a way forward as a society. And I've seen a lot of arguments that are kind of some version of permaculture is not about any of this rigmarole and high-minded nonsense. It's about homesteading or growing food. And then the kind of opposing viewpoint is, well, that's not the important part at all. The important part is culture. And so I don't necessarily want to weigh in on either side of that. What I want to say is zoom back a little bit and look at the kind of meta narrative there. We're talking about how to grow food. We're talking about culture. So in order to understand our existing culture, I think it's important to understand how important traditional agriculture is to the way that we exist as a society, right? When we don't know much about hunter-gatherer societies, right? We sort of kind of know something about them, but they didn't have languages as far as we know. They didn't really have records as far as we know, so we don't really know how they worked. It's also really interesting that the skull that a lot of like depictions of Neanderthals or Denisovans or early like proto-humans are based on, we're pretty sure that it was a skull that had a debilitating bone condition. That it was like a child that had died relatively early from this degenerative bone disease. So like when we see these like hunched over kind of monsters that are like sort of halfway between a chimpanzee and a human, we don't necessarily have the fossil record to support that that ever existed. Like it's conceivable that for like the last 100,000 years, people have looked almost exactly like we did. But what we do know is that around 12,000 years ago, or I'm sorry, not 12,000, yes, 12,000 BC, all of a sudden, there were these cities. And these cities universally were built around agriculture. This is basically what happens. And we don't know exactly why that happens, but it's fairly intuitive to assume that it's some version of like, well, instead of roaming for miles and miles and miles to find where there's food, what if we knew where the food was going to be forever? What if it was here in this great, beautiful, fertile valley, and we've got water and we've got all this stuff? What if we didn't have to travel around? And so what's really cool is that we have all these myths that are kind of about that transition. And you may remember the Epic of Gilgamesh from like your 8th grade English class or like your freshman college like literature class or something, right? It's not something that we read a lot. It's a really cool story because it's a story from one of the oldest cultures on the planet. And in this story, we have Gilgamesh, who's this king, and he sort of represents civilization. Like his whole deal is that he's like, well, we're not going to act like savages. We're going to have rules. We're going to have laws. There's going to be justice. We're going to have money. He comes up with written language. He does all this cool stuff. And he's got this kind of advisor, kind of best friend character named Enkidu. And Enkidu's kind of a traditionalist. He's like, well, this stuff is pretty cool, but we don't want to lose touch with the old ways. And he's kind of irritated at Gilgamesh about a lot of stuff. They kind of have some conflict. They kind of go their separate ways on some mythological quests. And Enkidu's quest is he's repeatedly approached by these different representations of civilization. Like he has like holy men come to him. He has all these different kind of like sort of civilized people come to him and say, look, man, I know that it's scary, but this city is awesome. Like it has walls. We've got all this food. Like it's great. And one of the big problems these two characters have been trying to figure out what to do about is there's this forest that has all the best lumber in it. And it's guarded by this horrible monster named Humbaba. That's this giant, terrible, like shape-shifting monster. And the picture that you're seeing right there is the depiction of these two guys, tradition and civilization, coming together to kill Humbaba to get the resources that are in this forest. And there's a read on the Epic of Gilgamesh that it's literally the story of the birth of modern agriculture. And in that story, the solution is to clear cut the forest, to plant plants there, and to just start extracting resources. And that's kind of been the narrative ever since. Our civilization is extractive because it's based on extractive agriculture, right? There's another story in the Bible. There's Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. I'm just kidding. The Coat of Many Colors, right? Joseph gets shipped off to Egypt. This is like proto-Egypt before it's like really established. The king has a dream. that there's going to be 7 years of like abundance. There's going to be 7 years of famine. Joseph says, well, why don't we take a portion of that 7 years of abundance and store it? And then Egypt becomes the most powerful government in the world because they started extracting resources. Now, when that was happening, I don't think that was necessarily, I don't think there was like a grand conspiracy to destroy the planet. This is the human beings, our ancestors going, okay, like what can we do? We're tired of getting killed by jaguars and like having to run around in the woods. The woods are scary, right? Like we don't want to be there. That's not really our realm. We're going to build these nice open spaces. We're going to stay in these nice open spaces. And we're going to we're going to take all these resources that we've seen out there. We're going to bring them to where we are. It's going to be awesome. And I think there's a really interesting parallel between the deep jungle. If you picture like a deep, deep, deep forest, right? How alien that is to humanity. Like we don't live in the forest. We live kind of on the edge of the forest. We like to kind of be able to see out in front of us. And currently, we call city centers like the urban jungle, right? Like we have almost exactly the same kind of misgiving fears about city centers. And there's some of that is rooted in some cultural kind of attitudes, some inherent racism stuff. But beyond that, we're just deeply mistrustful of places that are enclosed. So in the same way that our ancestors kind of moved into these sort of sprawling agricultural cities, we have moved into the suburbs because we like open spaces, right? But in order to live in those open spaces the way that we live in them right now, it requires a tremendous amount of resources being shipped from all over the world. And I don't have to explain, I mean, I think everybody on this call almost certainly is aware of the issues that we have as a society in terms of our supply chains. But what I'm talking about really here, because some of you are probably going, what does this have to do with residential abundance? What I'm talking about is that the way that we grow food and our culture are inexorable. Our culture is the way that we grow food. So if you're talking about changing the way that we grow food, you are talking about changing the culture. And what this has to do with, and vice versa, what this has to do with residential abundance is that residential abundance is choosing to live deliberately, right? This illusion that there is abundance that's created by this extraction, we're increasingly aware this is an illusion, right? We know this doesn't actually work. When the coronavirus thing first started, there was this amazing thing that happened where everything ground to a halt. And instantly, people started buying seeds, right? Like all of Baker Creek was out of seeds. Johnny's was out of seeds. It's been the most difficult spring to be a landscape designer in history because you guys bought all the fruit trees. And I thought, wow, all it took was a couple of weeks of interruption for people to go, what is any of this? What are we doing, right? What is the economy? What are all of these forces that have this control over my life? And like, this doesn't make any sense. This isn't connected to anything meaningful. And so when we're talking about residential abundance, what I think we're talking about is the intersection of humanity and our relationship to resources, right? Your house is made of all of these resources that you didn't mine yourself, that have been assembled into this building, that are on top of this land. And if we really want to get to a place where that system or some version of that system, a new version of that system, is working regeneratively, we have to understand that extraction has to turn around. But the cool thing is, we accidentally terraformed the planet in like one generation. Like we went from being basically not industrialized, and then in like 200 years, we've completely destroyed the biosphere. And it's really easy to get depressed about that, but it's also kind of a fun exercise to realize like how amazing it is that people accidentally terraformed the planet to almost unlivable conditions in like 100 years. That's incredible. Imagine what would happen if that same energy was put into not doing that. And instead of being extractive, into putting those resources back into the biosphere. So in that same way that we talked about, what if you gardened for other organisms? What if your interactions with your neighbors was about giving away? Well, what if everybody did that? What if that was what our culture was based on, about all of us trying to give away more than we take? How quickly would there be more abundance than anyone can possibly even fathom? If we deliberately started trying to create that abundance, if we could accidentally terraform the planet in 100 years, how quickly could we create literally utopia? I would suggest pretty quickly, or at least a lot more quickly than it might seem like, you know, right now in kind of this scary place that we're at as a species. So I'm going to bring this all back home now. The 3 keys to residential abundance. I've designed them around the permaculture principles, right? So we have earth care, a well-tended garden that has a good plan, that is being designed from patterns to details, that is maximizing turning those problems into solutions, is better than an unmanageable homestead. If you have a giant 30-acre homestead that you can barely keep up with, and you're like having to compost half of what you grow because it's more than you could ever use. I mean, I have nothing against people who are homesteading. I think that's amazing. And if it's working for you, that's great. But if you have just like a huge piece of land that like isn't doing anything, and it's just kind of unbalanced and destabilized, you're like having to like mow it with a bush axe or whatever, I would argue that a single little tiny garden that's in a place that's bringing community together and in kind of getting these ideas going in people's heads, I think that's ultimately more meaningful. People care. Meet your neighbors. I'm positive that if you start introducing yourself to your neighbors, and I'm guilty of this too, again, but if we start to work with the people that are right around us, not worry about things, you know, the national conversations or the international conversations as much. If you meet your neighbors and you guys start working together, all that stuff's going to pretty quickly resolve itself, I think. And then we're going to have changed the culture. And I think that is by definition permaculture. So thank you so much for this. Hopefully I have not been too abstract or too weird. Like I said, I am happy to answer any questions that you have. Here are all the ways that you can contact me. I am really bad at social media. So I would suggest maybe emailing me if you have a specific question. If you have any questions about any of the kind of crazy stuff that I've been talking about, if you do just want to talk about what kinds of varieties of cassava you should be growing, or what kinds of, how to make a cocktail mango or whatever, I am happy to answer any questions that have come in the chat. And also feel free to reach out to me as you like. I try to be pretty available. So that is residential abundance.
Greg, thank you. You are a gift in the community. It is wonderful and fascinating to hear you. Could you repeat your connection, the way to get connected to you for your connected landscapes? What would be the easiest way?
Yeah, I mean, so probably the intersection of all of them, you can just go to the website. So it's connected landscapes. I'm going to put it in chat.com.
Now, Greg does amazing designs on residential systems, and I highly recommend talking to him. He has graciously donated a phone consult to one individual on this call. And to win that, all you have to do is go to our Facebook Sustainable Kashi group and say what the biggest takeaway from this class is, which there's a long list of things to list. Greg, you're an amazing teacher. I really want to thank you for being here, and I'm glad to have you as a colleague in this.
If I am an amazing teacher, it's only because I was taught by the best, and I want to just turn that gratitude right back around, man.
Thank you.
You were the one that set me on the path of, when I came into this, like a lot of people, it was very much about like, okay, how can I grow food? How can I turn this into a business? And going through your class was where I first started to go, oh, we might be needing to have a much broader conversation. But one hand washes the other. It really does. I really believe that.
Thank you. Thank you. And please join us in the Facebook community page. If you have any questions for Greg, you can type it in there, and that's a great place to answer questions. We'll be there for the next hour or so. So please come over there and you can answer them anytime you can have time. I want to thank Amy Zelt for keeping our production going. These calls get smoother and smoother every week. Thank you so much for all your hard work behind the scenes. If you got anything out of this call, please feel free to donate. It helps keep us going. Pays for the calls, pays for Zoom and all that. This video will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so you can watch it later, and there's a lot to absorb, so I would recommend watching it again. Next week, we're going to have Caitlin Fogarty talking about myco-permaculture, so that is definitely a subject that you're going to want to be a part of. So today, we're in a time of opportunity. And we have the knowledge and the ability to create abundance by reconnecting to nature. As we do this, we can reframe how we look at wealth. We can choose to measure success in healthy food or clean water or the happiness of our friends and family. And this opportunity to redesign the way we live our lives and connect with our communities is a true gift of this time we are all living through right now. So I suggest we all take advantage of it and help redesign our residences and redesign our lives. So thank you all for joining us in this important topic, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you again, Greg.
Thank
Bye.
you, Greg.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you at Facebook.
See you on Facebook.